All right, let's do it. So we've talked about what the general primary features of liberalism are. It's about protecting the individual rights of people, takes a more laissez-faire attitude towards economic matters, right? And it says that the purpose of the government is actually to protect people's liberties and their property, and the government receives its authority and legitimacy from the consent of the governed. You can have a liberal society that follow those values and abides by them, but they can have different forms of government. He mentions these in chapter 10 and offers a brief description of them. Does anybody know what a pure democracy is? If you think about it, you can probably...
It's when the entire community has say, so like every little thing is voted on by every citizen.
Right, exactly, yes. A pure democracy is a form of government in which the community together makes the laws and decides how to enforce them. And when I say makes the laws and enforces them here, I don't mean that everybody in society goes out into the streets with bats and beats up criminals. That's not what I mean by enforces. I mean that every person in society, or at least every citizen, has a say in what the laws are and what the enforcement looks like. That's what I mean. One advocate of this kind of form of government was actually John Stuart Mill, who I mentioned earlier. He's also the guy that we read for utilitarianism, right? Another form of government that's possible, that abides by liberal values, is a republic. Does anybody know what a republic is? Anybody remember their AP government class? A republic is actually what we have in the United States. A lot of people describe it as a democratic republic. A republic is a form of government in which a small group of individuals make all the laws and figure out how to enforce them. But that group of individuals is elected by the people in society. Obviously, due to the kind of government that we have today, the founding fathers were advocates for a republican style of government, in which the community elects representatives that make decisions for them. Another possible form of government is an oligarchy. Does anyone know what an oligarchy is? A plutocracy and an epistocracy are forms of oligarchy. It's similar to a republic, but it has one important difference. An oligarchy is a form of government in which a small group of individuals makes the laws and enforces them. But that small group of individuals isn't elected by the community. They're just there ruling and doing their thing. They can be decided through other means, perhaps. Like consent, if we all consent to have a certain small group of people forming up our government. Like I said, one kind of oligarchy is a plutocracy. Does anybody know what this looks like? Who the people are that are calling the shots? The people with the money. A plutocracy is ruled by the wealthy. You can also have an oligarchy that takes the form of an aristocracy. What do you think this is ruled by? Pay attention to this prefix right there. Close. Did you say moral?
No, I didn't. I said epidemic.
Oh, epidemic?
Prefix epi.
Oh, yeah, it is. Yeah, it's basically ruled by the smart people. Yeah. So an aristocracy is like, for example, ruled by the philosophers. This is something that Plato actually advocated for. Unsurprisingly, right? He thought that the people making the laws and calling the shots should be the knowledgeable people, the philosopher kings. And then you can have a liberal monarchy. And y'all know what a monarchy is, right? How many people rule in a monarchy? Like one, right? Maybe 1.5, 2, if they're married or something. But normally it's the king who calls the shots, right? Hobbs was actually an advocate of monarchy. At least that's what he says in his book, Leviathan. But this is actually a matter of historical debate, because a lot of people think Hobbes just put that in there because he was feeling pressure from the crown and he didn't want to die. So he made sure to say monarchy's the way to go, so he doesn't lose his money and his social status and stuff. Whatever form of government that a liberal society takes, they all have one important thing in common. When the person or the group who has political authority dies, the authority reverts back to the members of society to determine what to do with it. This is not the way that monarchies in Europe were operating around Locke's time, right? If the king or queen dies, simply whoever's next in line takes the throne, right? The authority to govern is not returned to the people. But in a liberal society, that's the way it's supposed to work. That kind of makes up what he has to say in this chapter 10. Does anybody have any questions about that? It's pretty straightforward. In chapter 11, we get a clearer picture of what the government's role is in a liberal society, as well as what the government can and cannot do. If I were to summarize it, I would say, according to Locke, in a liberal society, the government's role is to follow the natural law, preserving society, the liberties of its individuals, and looking out for the public good. There are a bunch of things, on Locke's view, that the government cannot do to you, that the government has no right or authority to do to you. What do you think some of these might be? What can't the government do to us in the United States, for example? Right? Yeah, they can't stomp all over our liberties, can't violate our civil rights. Think really basic. Right. The government can't just kill us when it wants. Think about something a little crueler.
Systematic killing, aka genocide?
That's true, can't commit genocide. It can't enslave us either. And the government cannot purposefully impoverish any member of society. According to Locke, the government can't just show up at my door one day and say, let's fuck with Gunner today. We're going to take all his stuff and burn his house down. Can't do that. And the government can't purposefully harm me. Now the government can do these things if they are given the consent of the governed. So capital punishment is a thing, right? In the United States, we've consented to the government carrying out capital punishment in certain circumstances, right? But they can't just kill anybody willy-nilly. or arbitrarily. There are other rules that the government have to follow. One of those rules is that the government must operate according to the laws that it legislates. It can't break its own laws. That doesn't stop any of our current politicians from doing that. Hey-o. But anyway, it's not supposed to. That means that it can't rule over us or govern over us willy-nilly or arbitrarily. The government also has no right or authority to take anyone's property or the fruits thereof without their consent. Basically, just preface all of these with, unless society gives consent to the government to do that. Otherwise, they can't do this stuff. Because these violate the natural rights that we have. The government can only tax individuals who have given their consent to be taxed also. And finally, this is one that we don't think about, but it's a really important one nonetheless. The government can't transfer its authority or legitimacy or legislative power to anyone else unless we consent to it.
Yeah.
How bad is it? Where's that?
It says Pittsburgh specifically, till 8:30.
Till 8:30. Okay.
The warning is in the law.
Rain.
There's no way 20 minutes.
Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, what are the odds of a tornado touching down in the city?
There are buildings.
Good luck developing in the middle of it. Or getting over the mountain.
We're probably fine, right?
We have been fine
Yeah, there's absolutely
for a good while. Unless it rains so hard that it starts to flood.
That's
I don't know. When did it flood last?
So unless we give the government the consent or the right to do this, the government can't just say, oh, by the way, we're giving our governing authority to Portugal today. You have to listen to what Portugal says. No. The authority and legitimacy that the people have placed in the hands of the government is theirs and only theirs until we say otherwise. To sum all of this up, the government in a liberal society rules for the good of the people, fundamentally, and it must not overstep its bounds. I'm going to read one more little passage from the reading for today. And it's going to be on page 43 and 44 at the bottom, section 142. These are the bounds which the trust that is put in them by the society and the law of God and nature have set. to the legislative power of every commonwealth in all forms of government. First, they are to govern by promulgated established laws, not to be varied in particular cases, but to have one rule for the rich and the poor, for the favorite at court and the countryman at the plow. Secondly, these laws also ought to be designed for no other end, ultimately, but the good of the people. Thirdly, they must not raise taxes on the property of the people without the consent of the people, and this properly concerns only such governments where the legislative is always in being, or at least where the people have not reserved any part of the legislative to deputies to be from time to time chosen by themselves. And finally, the legislative neither must nor can transfer the power of making laws to anybody else or place it anywhere but where the people have. So that's those are the primary features of a liberal society. What I would like to do now, if I can, is project the Declaration of Independence up on screen and kind of show you how the classically liberal theory that we've been looking at today shows up explicitly in our founding documents. I'm going to have to turn this on, that's what I'm going to fall over. I hope this works. If it doesn't work, we'll just have to read it. Oh, perfect. Is that going to go away, do you think? Okay, nice. All right. Can I get somebody to read that first small paragraph there? Anyone?
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's gods entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to this separation.
Good. So, what is the Continental Congress saying here? What do we see in these first two lines that you can draw on from what we've been talking about today? Well,
So this is people taking, action in what was being said here, the idea that okay, like we don't consent anymore to the way we are being ruled to us being under this government, and so is that correct?
right. Yeah, exactly. Everybody has the natural right not only to dissolve the government if it's no longer fulfilling its role, but also to set up a government if they want. Anybody has the natural right to just go out and set up a society if they want. And that's what the Founding Fathers did, right? They're like, we've had it with this British Empire. We're going to dissolve our ties to them and we're going to set up our own state, right? Another thing that is kind of implied in those first few lines is that this isn't something that people should do lightly. Right? Declaring independence or seceding, from some empire or government is not a thing to be taken lightly. It's very serious. Which is why they use the word necessary. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary to do this. Let's continue on. And to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. What is that? What are they referencing? Natural rights, right? The separate and equal station that we all have, just in virtue of being human. We all have these natural rights that ought to be respected, that don't come from the government, they don't come from society, we just have them. And then they say, of course, all right, we're going to tell you, King George, why we're doing this. Let's continue on. Could I have somebody read the next sentence?
We hold these truths to be self-efficient, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are institutions among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such forms as to themselves seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Right, that was a long one, right?
Yeah. That's a long sentence.
So they start this off. We hold these truths to be self-evident. These truths that people have natural rights. Right? Rights that they have just in virtue of being human. That all men are created equal. We're all equal under the law and in the eyes of God. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Rights that ought not be infringed no matter what. Right? The government can't overstep its bounds and stomp on your rights. Certainly not your natural rights. That's the worst one. That among these natural rights are life, liberty, and they took a more kind of socially nice view of it, pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. What does that say? What's the purpose of government?
To secure the rights.
To secure our rights. Right. The government works for us. The government gets its authority, right, as they're going to say, right, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, just like Locke said. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, if they're not fulfilling their purpose, if they're not safeguarding the rights and interests of the people, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish the government and to institute a new one, laying its foundations on such principles that they just said, all that crap, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Rule of the majority, right? When the people form a new government, or they form a new society, it's ruled by the majority who decides the direction that goes. All right, let's continue on. Can somebody read the next sentence from Prudence?
Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed.
Nice. So again, what do we see in this sentence? What are they saying? We kind of touched on this earlier, right? This is a serious thing that they're doing, right? This isn't something to be taken lightly. And it's not something you do if you're just upset at your government for a day, right? They say, governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And they say, experience has shown that it's often better for society to suffer injustices when they are sufferable, when they're not too bad, than to set up a new government, because that's very hard to do. And it incurs a lot of risk. Right? The British Empire wasn't very happy when we did this, right? We weren't best buds after this happened, right? But let's continue. Can somebody read from but to the end of the sentence? All right, I'll do this one. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for their future security. What are they saying here of the British Empire? Have they been treated fairly? Are they happy about their treatment? No, they've experienced, they say, a long train of abuses and usurpations that seems to impel them towards a state that will reduce them under absolute despotism. And so what can they do? What can they do about this? What are they allowed to do just in virtue of having natural rights? Right. It is their right. And then he says, no, it is actually their duty, their moral and political duty, to throw off such a tyrannical government and to provide new guards for their future security, to set up a new sovereign, to set up a new government. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. And then they go on, right, to talk about the long train of abuses that they've experienced and why they're doing this. So you can see right here, in at least this founding document, and you can see it too in the Constitution of the United States, right? The idea that we have these natural rights that ought to be respected. We have a right, a duty to replace our government when it no longer fulfills its role, when it's not looking out for a public good. And that the purpose of the government is to basically look out for us. That's why we call elected representatives civil servants, right? They're supposed to do their job in service of the people. So, we see it there in black and white how the founding of the United States is supposedly based on these liberal ideals. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States are evidence of that. They were reading Locke, and Jefferson and Thomas Paine especially liked what he had to say, and they're like, all right, we're going to build a society based on these ideas here. In the Declaration of Independence, we see broadly, well, their declaration to separate from the British Empire, right? Independent. Does anybody know some of the reasons why? We didn't get into it there, but what were some of the reasons why the colonies were like, we're getting the hell out of this empire, this is dumb, and it ain't working for us?
Taxes.
Right, say more about that.
I just know there was like really high taxes on imported goods.
Right, that's one of the big ones.
Also, the church wanted a lot of money from everything.
Say that again?
The church wanted a lot of money from everything since it was connected to the monarchy.
Yeah, that's true too. They felt broadly that they were being treated unfairly, right? The British Empire was taxing them heavily, and this is an important point, without giving the colonies representation in British Parliament. That's where the whole no taxation without representation comes from, right? The colonists generally believed that Great Britain was violating their natural rights, right? And so Congress voted for independence. And what kind of government did the founding fathers set up for us?
Democratic.
It's democratic. It's a republic because we have elected representatives, right? In a pure democracy, majority vote would determine who the president is. But we have the electoral college and all this stuff. They gave us a federal representative democratic republic. You all know that we don't just have state government, we also have the federal government that has certain roles and responsibilities and governs in a certain way. That's the federal aspect. Representative aspect is that we vote people in who make decisions for us on our behalf. Then, of course, the Democratic Republic is kind of reiterating that. We choose who our elected representatives are through the democratic process by voting. And then they're the ones that make the laws and vote on enforcing the laws. This is classical liberalism. When you think of classical liberalism, think of natural rights, think of consent of the governed, and think of the idea that the government's job or role is to protect our rights and our stuff. We do not work for the government. The government is supposed to work for us, for the public good. There are some obvious pros to setting up society in this way, right? Rights seem good, rights seem nice. It seems a good way to set things up that there's a standard of proper treatment that we're all supposed to follow in virtue of us having natural rights. of course, there are also weaknesses to this way of doing things. So let's have a brief discussion about that. And then I'll let you all go here. Can anybody think any weaknesses of this way of organizing society? Yeah.
So the main one that I was thinking of is free market.
Okay.
I believe that's the main or the biggest one. Like you were saying, that leads to people, they put money, they prioritize money over their well-being and people's and everyone's well-being. And just what happened during the pandemic, for example, how we ran out of like basic supplies and stuff like that because there was like no regulation. People were like buying toilet paper just to sell it.
Right.
So, I don't think that's fair and that's not the right thing to do. So I think that leads to that, among other things.
Yeah. I actually wrote this one down because I think it's one of the major criticisms of it. If the people in society are not careful in liberal society, their consumer choices and the people that they elect can allow for the emergence of crony capitalism and corporatism. By crony capitalism, I mean like capitalists who are violating laws or getting around safety regulations, taking some sort of control of the way things are done in virtue of the wealth that they have. And because we have something like a free market, our consumer choices can allow giant, extremely wealthy corporations to develop. And we don't have too many economic regulations, right? Y'all have smartphones, they're pretty great, but because everybody bought Apple computers and iPhones, now Apple can get away with a bunch of stuff and it has a lot more power than it otherwise would have, right? It gets kind of depressing when you realize that, oh shit, like this occurred under our watch and we didn't know any better, but we kind of let it happen. What are we going to do now? Can anybody think of any other weakness? Sure.
So, in a democracy like this, the majority rules, but there's also, I believe, a lot of people feel like they're not being, their opinion is not being taken for consideration.
Sure.
Like what he said actually about like marijuana and the legalization, like it kind of like reminded me of that. I remember like a couple years ago before marijuana was legalized in Arizona, there was I remember voting and we were like, I think it was like 49% of people said yes and then like 51 said no.
Right.
So it was always like, oh, okay, now it's legal, but like back then I remember that. Like I remember thinking, well, I know that there's like more people thinking that it should be legal, but not everyone is voting, or
right.
not everyone is being, you know, like, or not everyone is able to vote, or not everyone has a voice. So.
Right, yeah, I mean, that's kind of a weakness just in democratic systems, naturally, I had a student that told me in my other section that one study that they had cited showed that 70% of voters vote on like name recognition and not actually based on the platform of the elected representative. That's another thing that you have to worry about when it comes to democratically organized societies. There's no intervention for people voting who don't know what they're doing or who haven't researched the issues, right? That's a problem that's always going to plague democratic societies, is that you can have a bunch of U-Haws voting. But yeah, it's not a weakness that is specific to liberalism. How's this for an interesting weakness? We said earlier that the United States was like a melting pot, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have people who live in the United States that come from a bunch of different backgrounds and cultures and races and ethnicities who have different beliefs and values. That, combined with the fact that liberalism privileges the rights of people and free speech, means that liberalism contains an inherent weakness. It allows for its own erosion. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean something like this. Anybody in a liberal society is free to criticize the hell out of it. Anybody can say whatever they want about the way government is organized, pretty much about anything. Other societies, some other societies don't allow that, right? If you have a dictatorship, or if you have a socialistic society, for example, it might not abide by criticisms of how it is organized. The king ain't going to let you talk bad about the king or what the king's doing. Authoritarian regimes are not going to allow you to talk bad about how things are going. You're going to get stuck in prison or you're going to be killed. Liberal society lets anybody say whatever the hell they want. And because anybody can criticize liberalism itself, and because the individuals in society come from such different backgrounds and have different beliefs and values, it allows for its own undoing. Because we have a democratic process, we could make liberalism go bye-bye if we wanted to. We could turn our society, our form of government, into a monarchy if we wanted to. We could all vote on it. So it contains the seeds of its own erosion. Do you all understand kind of what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
If the inhabitants aren't careful, if they're not taking their rights and their privileges and duties seriously, liberalism will undo itself. And that's actually what's happening right now.
I have an idea of a weakness, but I'm like trying to find the language in my head to express it, because I kind of like Hobbs and idea of like way back in high school, which is people vote for stuff, but it's really, really hard to get that sort of legislation on the table to be voted for in general. You know what I mean? Like make a new law or change laws.
Right.
This whole entire process that's like almost nearly impossible to get anything like substantial done. So if you wanted to vote on something, it would be like voting for shift slightly
Right.
down rather than, actually changing something entirely.
Right, and
But that's more of a criticism of or a weakness of the democratic republic versus your liberalism anyway. So.
and a lot of that I think has to do with this too.
Okay.
I don't know why lobbying isn't illegal. But pharmaceutical companies, for example, or defense contractors can lobby the hell out of Congress to pass laws that benefit them, right? So yeah, it's kind of connected to this, but I definitely see what you're saying, yeah. Here's one more weakness. And this is something that I guarantee all of you feel. But you probably just haven't put it into these terms. Because liberalism's main focus is on preventing people from violating others' rights, and by making it clear what we're not allowed to do and what government is not allowed to do to us, it doesn't offer us a positive story or a positive theory of meaning. Liberalism leaves people culturally and existentially unmoored. There isn't a narrative or a mythology or a state religion that we can find meaning and purpose in. Because everything's allowed in liberalism and none of it is advocated for, at least not officially. When you have a society that allows people to be free in the ways that we are free, that also means that people are free from the ties that bind them to their culture and a way of life and meaning and purpose for their existence. How many of y'all have, been kept up more than one night because you're like, oh God, does my life have any meaning? What am I doing here? Does my existence mean anything? Liberalism doesn't have any answers for you. It's not designed to have answers for you. Liberalism offers no positive story or mythology to make sense of your existence, why you're here, and what you're supposed to be doing. Does that make sense? Do you kind of see what I'm saying?
Yes, so, but should a government do that?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that would be.
It's a good question.
That sounds more like.
But I know what you mean.
That's not necessarily, or is that this? I guess that's the question. Is that the same as forcing religion to give people a purpose?
It's not exactly the same.
Yeah.
But yeah, the main point is something like liberalism isn't designed to tell you what your life means or what you should do with it or whether or not you have a reason for being here.
There's kind of no common goal, and everybody is out for themselves in a way.
Right.
When someone's doing successfully. Now, I've found that with communities that are more privileged and they do find a good spot, they tend to lose their culture more and more, whereas people who do end up in bad places where they end up impoverished because they have to rely on each other to survive on community, they end up more fulfilled in that aspect of their lives.
That's kind of why I included culturally in here, because since we are a melting pot and since we abide so many different cultures and views, we don't really have a strong cultural or ethnic identity. Because we all come from different walks of life, right? And forget about national identity. Maybe people people in the 50s had a strong national identity. But if you talk to your friends, how many of them are proud to be an American? Right? So liberalism, in the freedom that it grants people, because it gives them the freedom to kind of be and think anything, it doesn't give them anything that they can structure their lives with or use to make meaning out of. There are more weaknesses in this, but I think these are probably the main ones. Anybody have any questions, comments, concerns?
Something that did occur to me when thinking about this mainly pertains to the second one there, that it allows for its own erosion. So what about the inverse of that? What if a system which I, previously identifies as liberal then goes to some measure, whether it's drastic or small relative to some sort of thing. What if it goes to some sort of measure to preserve itself? Say, like, for instance, I'm certain that throughout American history there have been lawful assemblies that have been broken up just for the sake of fear to instill some sort of, and then there are probably people who've been tossed into vans and never seen again.
That's yeah.
So
yeah.
Yeah, like it just makes me think, well then, if that is allowed to happen, if the laws of liberalism are contradicted, what authority keeps that in check if nothing really happens? And then what incentive does that government system have to strictly adhere to what it should be under a liberal system?
That's a good question. I think one of the main reasons why we have so many of the problems we have is simply the scale of our society. We're so damn big. In so many different institutions, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing, right? People fall through the cracks. They don't get the resources that they need, the help that they need. It would probably be better for us if we kind of resorted back to a society that was much smaller. But, how are we going to do that now? Is that a thing that people want to do? I don't know. People don't really care about this stuff. They like watching cat videos on their phones and watching Squid Game, which I did finish, by the way. I actually watched Squid Game because all my students were bugging me about it. They were telling me to watch it.
Is it really that good? I've seen like the second episode.
7.5 out of 10. It's got some. It kinda, yeah.
We're gonna play a game, live or die.
Yeah, pretty much. But anyway, that's liberalism. Next week we're going to talk about other forms of social organization that are not liberal. Anarcho-capitalism is kind of liberal a little bit. But anyway, yeah, if you have any questions or whatever, or just want to chat, email me. But you're all free to go.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a lovely weekend.
See ya. You too.
Just didn't get